This is On Diversity, a podcast series by the Institute of Policy Studies, Singapore. I'm your host, Ong So Chin. Today's episode is called Diversity and the Singapore Media. Once upon a time, traditional media was the main channel of information. We read the daily newspaper, tuned into a couple of TV channels, and listened to a few radio stations. Transmission stopped at midnight, and we all went to bed. The youth of today have never known such a world. They only know one where information is diverse, fragmented, and constantly on 24/7. They also want to discuss issues more openly, even sensitive ones like race and religion, and to see more diversity represented in their everyday lives. And if Singapore media doesn't meet their requirements, they have access to a world of information in borderless cyberspace. So what does that all mean for Singapore media? How can it stay relevant to all Singaporeans? Or should it? Does media have a role to play in leading public discourse or gathering a consensus? Should that be its job? And how can it walk the fine line between diversity and polarisation? With me today to discuss these issues and more are Mark Tan, founder of Rise Media. Hi, Mark.
Hello, hi. Thanks a lot for having me on this
Thanks
podcast.
for being on the show. And my colleague, Dr. Chu Han Yi, Senior Research Fellow at IPS, where he's the lead investigator for a long-term study on the aspirations and experiences of youth in Singapore. Hello, Han. Welcome to the program. We have a big topic today, so I guess a good place to start would be to define diversity and why it's important. Who wants to go first? Mark?
Sure, I can jump right into it. I think that at least from my perspective, so if you're talking about it from a media channel or media owner's point of view, obviously you'll be looking at diversity of perspectives in the newsroom. Specifically if you're a news organization that weighs in on fairly political subjects, then you would really be looking at diversity of
Right.
ideological viewpoints.
Right.
Okay, I think I should kind of preface this by saying that diversity of viewpoints doesn't mean that all views are given equal legitimacy. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's the starting point. But I think that it is important to be aware. Yeah, to be aware of the different ways of thinking and different frameworks, so that as a member of the audience or just as a regular person, right. You'll be able to kind of make a more informed decision.
You have traditional media, and then we have social media. And I guess Rise Media kind of fits in somewhere in between, where you're not really traditional media, but you're not really the rabble-rousing social media.
Yeah.
You're kind of a bit more sensible, I guess.
Well, on our good days. So I guess one distinction that can be made, or where we sit into the whole milieu of things, is that I think that if you're a newsroom, so a broadcast platform or CNA or ST, for example, then you would really have a responsibility to cover everything.
Sure.
But then when you go a little further down the line to independent media or kind of digital magazines like Rise Media, for example, our job is to really offer a more curated view.
Right.
So, and this is also kind of a function of the way we're set up, okay? Because we don't have the resources to cover everything.
Yeah.
Well, there could be 200 important things in the news. You
have to be selective.
Yeah, the editor's job, or rather our job, is to make sure that, okay, out of these 200 different things that we can talk about, these are probably the 5 things that are really important today.
Right.
So our job is actually we are the voice that comes after the news.
Okay, that's a good positioning. So Han, what do youth want?
Maybe we'll start off with understanding the youth first.
Yeah, good point.
it's very easy to think of the youth as this monolithic group, this narcissistic generation, this YOLO generation. But I think what the study that we're doing has shown is that there are actually different types of youth, and they are multifaceted and diverse in their own ways.
Right.
You have people who are more concerned with traditional aspirations, what we call the old school ollies, where they still want their HDB flat, they still want a good paying job, and they still want to save towards retirement. But you also have liberal Lionels, people with more aspirational goals, who are less concerned with material aspirations. Yeah, so I think it's important to recognize that the youth in Singapore are diverse.
Right. That's a very, very good point. I think, we can't just put them all in a monolithic block, right? So, Mark, you are actually at the tail end of the millennial time band, right?
Yeah,
so you count as youth.
By the government's definition, I think I'm right at the tail end of it.
Yeah, so do you identify with Han's definition? Are you the first, the HDB dweller type, or the liberal lion type, the the second definition? Or neither?
Well, okay,
there are more. These
There are
are
more,
the-
right? Okay.
The way that I would kind of frame this, at least I can only speak for myself at this point. I think that there's a saying that it's more likely that you're a socialist when you're younger, you're more liberal when you're younger, right? And when life gets in the way, you become more practical. So like the Mark that you're kind of meeting today would be the more practical conservative Mark, right? But I still have that hangover
rebel
from
streak.
like my rebel streak.
But you're
So-
losing it quickly, oh dear.
And I think that my experience could reflect quite a lot of, it could reflect a bit of that diversity that you see in the youth today. Because like depending on which stage of their life they are, right, they could actually want different things.
It's like you, when you started Rise, right? You were at the beginning stage of being a millennial, being aspirational, you had ideals, right? Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I guess when I started Rice, I was already in my 30s. So I was like 31, 32.
Late bloomer, okay.
Yeah, so I mean, like, I think that the ideological, or rather like the identity that we had when we first started, right? Like, you know, we still very much want that to remain unchanged. Which means like, you know, like we're willing to take risks with the content that we do. We are willing to take a really open mind towards different kinds of thoughts. I think that where this is a little bit more measured now is that obviously as running it as a business, right, you have more practical concerns on that side. But
Right.
I think at the core of it, right, we haven't really changed that much in terms of like our identity,
Right.
right?
So how do you ensure diversity in your story? Sorry, Han, you were saying something.
No, I thought I'll jump in because that sounds like the story of a lot of our youth where when they were younger, the world is their oyster and their aspirations know no bounds. They want to do everything. But as they get older, they finish their NS, they finish their schooling, and they get a job. That's when they have to adult. So we do some adulting questions with the youth to understand what adulting means. I think the first sign of adulting is that they start to pay the bills. Like what Mark says, when you have to pay the bills, when you have to adult, then you have more considerations, you have more trade-offs. So the world is not my oyster anymore. Maybe there is still a pearl that I'm looking for, but it's not limitless. There are trade-offs.
Are the youth of Singapore, do they see themselves reflected in the media landscape? Are there enough options for them?
I think they have a lot more options than we were growing up.
That's true.
Yeah, like what you mentioned and what Mark has mentioned, as we were growing up or when we were growing up, it's Straits Times and maybe 联合早报, Berita. But now you have not only the news providers. So you have CNA, you have Rice Media, you have the mothership, SCMP even. But you also have various platforms. We get our news feeds not through just the apps for the news agencies, but also through Twitter, all the news aggregators. So that's lots of choices.
Yeah. And could that be a problem? Because sometimes you're faced with too many choices, you kind of can't really make up your mind, or you're torn in different directions, or you go down little rabbit holes.
I think we can take these conversations two ways. So there is the choices where we are spoiled for choices. I think I guess we have a shared view. There is choice.
Yeah.
But after the choices, and then youth like choice. They like to choose their own affiliations and choose the media outlook that most resonate with them. But after they make the choice, then they tend to fall into this pattern, right? So they fall into this pattern because this space is safe. I like the news that they share. It's edgy, it's woke. And then you're always chasing after this edgy news and you don't expose yourselves to other diversity. So you get locked in to these safe spaces, or take it to the other end of the spectrum. These are echo chambers, right?
So you form tribes, right? But that's the other danger as well, right? So Mark, you were saying earlier, I mean, trying to keep it real at Rice and to always reflect a diverse panoply of views, right? Is that difficult sometimes? I mean, how do you have your editorial meetings and when there's so many different points of view coming up and everyone wants to do something and you may not agree?
Well, I think before I guess answer the question, I just want to circle back a little bit on the previous point about the access to a variety of options. One thing that I have noticed, right, I would say that the youth of today, compared to where I was maybe when I was 20, they are way more informed. I would say that the level of like critical thinking has really shot up. So I would say that overall, I mean, if you look at it from a broad perspective, I feel that we are in a better place right now, simply because you would be able to engage on a wider variety of issues than you were, I think, like maybe 10 or 15 years ago. So I think that that's, to me at least, that's one of the plus points for having like more options.
Right.
Yeah.
So I'm going to be the contrarian here and say that yes, they're exposed to a lot of media channels and they're more informed. But whether or not they are critical consumers, it's something else. I think we can explore that a little bit because I've also seen instances where they react before they deliberate. So we know of the online vigilantes, the keyboard warriors, where they respond first and then, think, if they think at all, later. So the name and shame, or the people who break the mask wearing measures, post them on Facebook. I will make you famous. That's the
Right.
that's the line that's quite popular these days, right?
But is it only youth that are to blame for that?
No,
Or
I think it's everybody.
Yeah.
But I think
Storm started that culture, to be very frank with you.
But social media, right? It's the medium that sort of encourages this kind of perhaps antisocial behavior in a way.
Yeah, and also it's the way that youth or we consume news these days. Because I graze my news on my aggregators, and then my friends share on our WhatsApp group chats. But the long form reading, which I used to do, I do a lot less because time is very precious. And so I skim. I take in news on the bite-sized pieces. And I've also not done something for a long time, which is to read a newspaper broadsheet from cover to cover.
You have it online.
Yes, but I don't do that anymore.
Yeah,
You
we've
read
done
it in snack. You snack on the news. So when you read the news from cover to cover, I think the chances of being exposed to views or news articles that you're not looking out for, the serendipitous nature of picking up on news, is lost. Because when you have an aggregator tell you, or you tell the aggregator what news you want to consume, they will give you that news. And then the algorithms these days are so intelligent that if you like this piece of news on mask-wearing violators, maybe you will like these pieces of news too, right? So you get into this loop. That's the only diet that you consume.
Right.
Sure. I mean, there was a period of time when my Facebook feed where it was completely screwed up. I think it was a good 7 or 8 years ago. I was into a lot of intellectual dark web conspiracy theory kind of things. So I was getting fed all sorts of nonsense and
How did you pull out of that?
well, I mean, the thing is that it kind of adapts to your reading habits, so that changed over time, and then
So you were smart enough to realize, hey.
No, it wasn't. It wasn't a conscious change. I didn't go I need to change the algorithm. It's more my interest kind of just shifted.
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
Now that you are a responsible person leading a news business, just want to get down to the brass tacks of it, right? How do your editorial meetings go? Because I remember you told me you just ran a story. Rice Media just ran an interview with Xia Xue. I understand that was a point of contention with your editorial team.
I wouldn't say contention within the team, but then I think that there was a lot of debate on how we should approach the story. So this kind of ties back to your earlier question on how do I maintain diversity in the newsroom. I think that there are limits on that. I think that I would say that it's a much more practical approach for us to make sure that we have a culture of open-mindedness.
Yeah.
As opposed to hiring people let's just say we have 2 or 3 writers who have more liberal views. Let's hire 2 or 3 more writers with more conservative views. I don't think it works that way. I think generally speaking, it is a better approach, or how we try to maintain diversity in the newsroom, right, is to work with people who are generally open-minded. As human beings, we all have our own biases coming to the table. And I think that is fine. That's just normal. The part in which you're able to kind of interrogate your own biases and at the same time also think critically about it, right? That's an attitude, but it can also be taught.
Right.
So that's kind of how we try to do it. I think it's as much a process-driven thing and also a culture thing as well.
Right.
So for example, when I say a process thing, meaning that when we need to interview a more controversial personality like Xia Xue, the process that we have in place is what value are we actually bringing to the audience?
Yeah.
Amongst the different pieces of content or media or articles that are out there about her already, what hasn't actually been discussed yet?
And also, I guess some people would say, why give her the oxygen, right?
Yes. So in that particular case, right, it really needed to kind of touch on a slightly broader kind of issue for us to kind of get involved in that, because I think that enough has been said about her. And obviously, the opportunity for her is to come on board and try and clear the air for her. It's also a PR move on her part. I mean, of course, right? But I mean, for us, where it became interesting was that it was also a commentary on how on online echo chambers in essence.
Right, which is what Han mentioned earlier. It's just trying to break down those echo chambers,
Correct.
right, here from another point of view. So Han, I mean, talking about echo chambers and diversity, a lot of your work with Youth Steps, the youth program that IPS is involved with the National Youth Council, it focuses on youth from low-income families, right? Is there a difference in the kind of media they consume?
Not in the media they consume.
Right.
I think because of the almost ubiquitous access of smartphones, both the youths who are less privileged from lower socioeconomic income statuses, they consume on the same platforms.
Right.
But I think what we observe, not in youth steps, but in other studies, is that because they're more concerned with bread and butter issues.
Right.
So the use of the technology, the use of the media tends to be for entertainment. And then when you're in a privileged environment or background where you don't have to worry so much about the bread and butter, then you can use the media to learn, watch a scientific blog, video or something. So more like capital generating activities on the media. So you learn things on how to present yourself better in an interview or how to pick up digital skills, that kinds of activity. But when you have to worry about everyday concerns and paying the bills, then because you're already thinking about it so much in your daily life, the media then becomes a channel for release of the stress, to vent off steam. So they consume more entertainment.
Right. So not so much about following causes or climate change or whatever.
Yeah, it kind of results in a Matthew effect, we call it in social sciences, where the ones who are already privileged because they have the luxury to explore themselves more or to learn more, they are richer in their knowledge.
Right.
And those who have to resort to the media as an outlet for release of their stress, they kind of get stuck in that rut.
Right. I see. So that's something that's interesting, I guess, which you are exploring, and we'll get the results at some point.
Yep.
So this common thread that's coming up is this echo chamber thing and the diversity of views leading to echo chambers. We know that after GE 2020, the sentiment is that young people want to see more diversity in society and have more open conversations about sensitive issues. But at the opening of Parliament, Prime Minister Lee said that it's good to have diversity. He asked, but how do you make sure diversity doesn't lead to polarization? So what role should the media play in this?
I guess I can jump in here and talk about this a little bit, because very frankly, this has been on my mind as well. The one thing I know for sure is that we shouldn't look at the media as monolithic as well, and that I think that news organizations carry a different responsibility. So if you were looking at someone like the New York Times, I think that they would, or in fact a national broadsheet, a national kind of paper, right? I think that their responsibility is a little bit different from say independent media. This is not to say that we're not responsible for what we publish as well. We definitely are.
Yeah.
But I don't think it's the role of the media to help people make up their minds. I think that where we come in is really to be able to educate and enlighten, right? In an entertaining way. So the entertainment is important as well. You look at it as infotainment, which is why we put so much emphasis on the creative aspect of things, make it readable. All right. But I mean, the end goal, it really is to help the audience to understand situations a little better, to understand culture a little better, and then they can come to their own conclusions. Right. And I think that in terms of the polarization, right, I think that a lot of it comes down to education. I mean, I don't want to echo what the government has been saying about digital literacy and all that. But I mean, I think that it feels like the most logical and practical approach. Because even if you don't look at the media, right, there are, just across the GE, for example, there are so many fine examples of citizen journalism, coming up. Everything from your memes to just desktop commentators who aren't beholden to an editor or a newsroom, You're not going to stop that. There are just too many people out there with platforms at the moment who are actively blogging or creating content. And I think that the way we avoid that devolving into a bit of a cesspool, right, is that we are able to take a critical approach to things. Yeah.
So you mentioned New York Times, right, which is interesting because recently they were involved in a little bit of a kerfuffle because the opinion editor, James Bennett, he came on board and he tried to offer different points of view in the opinion section. And one op-ed that he published was from a conservative Republican senator who basically called for military intervention to stop the race riots in the United States. And there was a whole lot of controversy around that. And James Bennett ended up resigning. I just read a piece in the New Yorker about this, and the writer Andrew Marantz said, open debate is a wonderful thing, right? But is it possible to be so predisposed towards openness that you can blind yourself to what is in fact a clear and present danger?
Yep.
So when you're being so open, you're allowing different points of view. Some points of view maybe do not need airing, do not need amplification, perhaps?
Yeah, I completely agree there, actually. I think that in the case of Tom Cotton, that particular op-ed, there was a real danger that it would incite violence. I mean, this comes down to a bit of the more technical aspects of things. I think that, for you to publish something like this, for example, the editors need to be very mindful of the tone.
Yeah.
So instead of saying, roll in the troops, right, the headline itself could have been phrased as maybe more of a question and less of a kind of an assertion or a statement. Right. So I think it's these things that I think that went a little haywire. In Singapore, I feel, obviously there'll be situations where the the debate or the subject that we're talking about, right, has the potential to actually incite kind of like hatred or violence. And I think this is where like there is a clear responsibility on the editors, right, to make sure that they're not promoting that kind of result.
Yeah. So sound editorial judgment is still needed, and that's why you still have a job, Mark.
So if the if the objective, exactly right, like there's always that objective at the back of our heads, right? Like, are we actually enlightening or educating people? So that needs to be objective as opposed to, okay, like let's just put out an opinion and see what happens.
And Han, do you think youth need that guidance as well, right?
Well,
to a certain extent.
So there are two aspects to this. If we look at the media outlets or the news editors, I think they have a few responsibilities. Of course, one is to inform the public. Classically, we learned this in journalism school, that one of their roles of news editors is also to act as the gatekeeper of information. So there is some form of informed judgment. I think the mantra there or the guiding principle there is responsible creation.
Yeah.
And then in terms of youth, then it is about being able to consume critically. So it is a two-way street, right? You create responsibility and you consume critically.
That's good, yeah.
There is also this school of thought, right, which is called like kind of like constructive journalism. So I think that's pretty interesting, where the end result, a lot of the content of the work that you do, like, ends up in something that's fairly constructive. I mean, it's kind of idealistic and it's very lofty. So like, I mean...
That's fine. So, I mean, it calls to mind the SOAP Awards, which you're involved with, right?
Yeah.
Rice Media is involved.
Yeah.
The Stories of a Pandemic, which tries to bring journalists around, I guess, a common purpose. And to promote journalistic excellence at the same time, it's sort of meaningful journalism. It's kind of around what you're just talking about. So there is room for diversity, but at the same time, not too much diversity. There needs to be some kind of, I guess, a decision on what our values are first, right? What are our first principles? And then use that framework to guide this diversity. That's what I'm hearing.
Yeah. So I've heard something that is really interesting, or it's woke, but not too woke.
I think that maybe a better way to look at, I mean, for me at least, like, a better way to frame, for me, I think that diversity can be a little overrated in a sense. A better way to look at it is just, like, just to be critical about everything.
Okay.
Because, like, if you have that critical mindset, then you would generally be open to a wide range of views, but you don't take them at face value.
Sure.
Yeah, because I think that diversity, like, it's just almost an impossible ideal sometimes, especially in a smaller kind of organization, right? It raises all sorts of kind of problems at the end of the day, because how can we kind of like stay consistent on certain issues? But then knowing also that human beings are just inconsistent, generally speaking. I have friends who are like, they're in the LGBTQ community, and then they, at the same time, they're kind of like PAP supporters, It's possible to have these things.
Yeah.
Human beings are inconsistent. And I think that when that gets applied to, say, like creating content, journalism, right, these things tend to show up. So I think that forcing diversity is like, it can be very impractical.
Yeah. Agree.
Yeah, and actually take it from another perspective. I think the diversity for youth is especially important, that they have different views that they are exposed to and that they can bounce their own identities off, because they are at a very critical stage of their lives when they are forming their self-identities, and they don't need to be consistent. One day they want to be an environmentalist, they upload a few pictures to see what the community thinks of them as an environmentalist. Doesn't work out too well, and then maybe tomorrow I'll try to be a feminist who can also bake a mean sourdough bread, right? So they are trying their identities.
Trying on different hats.
In fact, a lot of them have identity crisis during this period. And so the media then becomes a space where they can explore their identities. And diversity like that is important for them to be able to pick and choose or to assemble their own self-identity.
Great. I want to talk also now a little bit about the practical challenges, Mark. We've talked about your existential, philosophical challenges. How are you paying the bills, and how do you keep a product like Rice Media afloat?
Well, I mean, our main source of revenue would be native advertising. We are essentially a content marketing agency. So we create content for different brands and businesses. And at the same time, also, like, we fulfill a bit of a strategic comms kind of role as well.
But do your readers buy that? Do they go like, oh, you're selling out?
I think that most of them, they understand that, like, because we don't charge a subscription and we need to pay our staff.
Sure.
So the thing that we have to be mindful of is that, like, we need to kind of understand what they like.
Yeah.
I mean, there's certain advertisers that we wouldn't work with. And I think that there also needs to be a level of transparency, because, I mean, like, And I'm pretty cynical about this. People hate ads.
That's true.
They really hate. Like when you go to a movie, right? Like you show up 20 minutes late because you want to skip all the advertising.
Yeah, but ads pay the bills.
But ads pay the bills, right?
So that's his dilemma.
A big part of this actually, right, is managing the cost on that end in the sense that like if we continue to chase views and chase the news, we're just circling the drain because we won't have enough cash to keep up with that. The objective here is that we're not trying to create another CNA. We're not trying to create another mothership. Our goal is really to impact journalism. We don't need to publish, say, 200 times a month.
Sure.
Right? 30 good pieces, for example.
Yeah.
That allows us to make as big of an impact, but then we keep our costs down. So a lot of it is very tight to the content model as well. But I mean, I'll be lying to say that if I say I've figured this out, 100%. The end goal for us at some point is that we want to be able to license that content.
Yeah.
So if you see a Rice show and say like Netflix or HBO one day, right, then that'll be great.
I'll look out for it.
Yeah, so that's what we're trying to build. But right now it's just advertising.
Right. So you mentioned paying the bills and paying your staff as well. I was just listening to actually a new narrative podcast with Sean Francis Han, who's the editor of activist news site, Wake Up Singapore.
Yep.
And he's talked about the transitional challenges when editors leave after a few years because it's a non-paying job essentially. And then they eventually find a job and they have to leave. It's just normal. It's part of growing up, adulting, right, Han? So then each new editor comes and brings their own input, and that continuity perhaps is lost. So that is a challenge, right?
I think that is definitely a challenge, simply because the news media industry, we're seeing a lot of like brain drain. I would say that a lot of the really talented writers or creators, right, they're not in journalism. But having said that, I think that right now there is enough talent. Like, Singapore, I think in particular, or Southeast Asia, Singapore has enough, I would dare say, kind of like, world-beating talent here. It's just that we got to find it.
Right.
My policy is that people can't work for free at Rice. So, that there is like a...
You don't exploit them.
But it also means that we spend a lot of money.
So maybe here we can call out, like, if anyone who is writing talent and wants a career in journalism, you can call Mark.
Yes, please.
Right? So we talked about role models for youth earlier. So do you think Mark is a role model?
Of course.
For young people?
I think he's able to pursue his passion.
Right.
Some of us with grey hair sensibilities have given up on our hopes and dream when we had to pay the bills when we were younger.
Oh gosh, yeah. So IPS is having a youth conference coming up, right? And Mark is actually going to be on it, from what I understand, Han?
Yes, Mark is one of the speakers on our panels.
This is the Young Singaporeans Conference?
Yep, it's a 3-day conference. We hold it every 2 years. We bring together young Singaporeans to talk about their personal choices, about life, about work, about their values. And this year, it's all about choices. And it's going to be digital because of the pandemic. But we want them to not just explore choices now, but the choices that they are making towards Singapore in the year 2030.
Right, because they're going to be shaping the future, aren't they? That's quite exciting.
I'm not sure how I feel about the role model portion. I can try, but I can talk about some of the wrong choices I've made.
Right.
And then how it turned out okay.
Okay. Well, okay. We're going to take it home. I'm going to ask you guys, how do you see the media landscape in 2030?
I mean, if anything, if the last GE is anything to go by, I think that in about 10 years, because the media usually reflects the cultural and social context as well. So we might not necessarily see more media outlets because, I think that we're a fairly small country as well. So there's limited room for that. But I hope to see, I would say more diverse options within the media outlets themselves.
So there's room for more diversity.
Optimistically speaking, you would see more diversity in, say, places like ST, for example.
Right.
Yeah. Simply because, that's kind of if the context, the population kind of moves that way, then there will be a need for that. Yeah. So I think that's
good.
Yeah.
So my crystal ball, and actually my hope, is that in 2030, the news that we consume or what we think of local news is not just in Singapore, but in the region. And young Singaporeans can venture out to beyond our tiny island to think we are a citizen of ASEAN.
Yeah, I would love to see that happen.
That would be fantastic.
I would love to see that happen.
And there's the real diversity there happening.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Han and Mark, for your time today. It's been a great discussion. And thank you too to all of you listening in. See you again next time.
Thanks.
Thank you.
On Diversity is a podcast inspired by the Institute of Policy Studies Managing Diversity's research program. We're available wherever you get your podcasts. Swipe on the cover art to see the show notes for more info on this episode or visit us on our website ipscommons.sg. Do subscribe to be notified when we have a new episode. And if you like what you heard, tell a friend or give us a 5-star review. It really helps other people find us. I'm your host, Ong So Chin, reminding you to always keep your body healthy and your mind open. Goodbye.